In 1951, Samuel Noah Kramer sat in the basement of the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia, surrounded by clay tablet fragments excavated from the ruins of Nippur in southern Iraq. He had been assembling a text the Sumerians called the Descent of Inanna. When he finally pieced together enough fragments to read the full sequence, he found something that changed Mesopotamian scholarship permanently. The text described the afterlife not as a vague spiritual concept, but as a mapped process with 5 distinct stages laid out in exact order. Every stage had specific locations, specific guardians, and specific procedures. More than 70 years later, those tablets are still sitting in museum archives in Philadelphia and Istanbul. The 5th stage contains a single detail that still troubles scholars because it describes something that should not appear in a Bronze Age document. The text known as the Descent of Inanna to the Netherworld survives on multiple clay tablets recovered from at least 4 ancient Sumerian cities. Fragments were excavated from Nippur, Uruk, and several smaller sites across what is now southern Iraq. These tablets were not written by the same scribe, they were not carved in the same century, yet they tell the same story in the same sequence with the same procedural details. When a text survives in this many independent copies from this many locations, scholars recognize it as canonical. This was not one city's local legend. This was a composition that the Sumerians treated as foundational knowledge, copied and preserved across generations the way a civilization preserves its most essential records. The Descent of Inanna is not the only text that describes the afterlife journey. At least 4 other major compositions contain overlapping details. The Death of Ur-Nammu describes a king's passage through the netherworld after his death around 2112 BCE. Gilgamesh, Enkidu and the Netherworld contains the most detailed catalogue of what the dead experience after arriving. The Death of Gilgamesh describes the hero receiving a permanent role among the judges of the underworld. Nergal and Ereshkigal, preserved in both a Middle Babylonian version from Amarna in Egypt and a Neo-Assyrian version from Sultan Tepe in Turkey, describes the governance structure of the realm of the dead. These are not retellings of the same myth. They are independent compositions from different periods and different cities, and they describe the same geography, the same sequence, and the same cosmic architecture. The scholars behind these translations are not fringe researchers. Kramer spent decades at the University of Pennsylvania assembling Sumerian literary texts. Thorkild Jacobson at Yale published The Treasures of Darkness in 1976, arguing that these underworld texts encoded genuine cosmological belief systems. Stephanie Daly of Oxford University produced the standard English translation still used by scholars today in her volume Myths from Mesopotamia. And in 2003, Dina Katz published the most comprehensive academic study of the Sumerian netherworld ever written. Katz argued that the consistency across all these texts suggests the Sumerians were not writing poetry. They were describing a cosmological system they believed to be as real and mappable as the physical world. The afterlife was a place with rules, it had architecture, and it had a sequence of events that every soul would undergo. That sequence begins not where most people expect. The journey does not start with death itself. It starts with what happens in the moments immediately after. The Sumerians had a specific word for what separates from the body at the moment of death. In Sumerian, they called it Yidim. In Akkadian, the later language of Babylon and Assyria, the word was Etemu. Modern translators sometimes render this as ghost or shade, but Katz argues in her 2003 monograph that neither translation captures what the Sumerians meant. The Giddim was not a haunting remnant. It was the complete identity of the person in a diminished form. It retained memory, personality, and emotional status. It was you, reduced but intact, standing beside your own body. The texts are explicit about what happens next. Without proper burial and specific funerary rites, the Giddim cannot begin its journey. It becomes trapped between worlds. The Sumerians called the essential funerary ritual Kispu. This involved food offerings, water libations, and the speaking of the dead person's name. The Japanese scholar Atsuki Moto documented in 1985 that the Kispu was not optional. It was a contractual obligation. The living owed the dead sustenance, and the texts describe in precise terms what happened when that obligation was not met. Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld contains the most unsettling accounting. In this composition, Enkidu descends to the Netherworld and returns to describe what he saw to Gilgamesh. He catalogues the fates of the dead with the precision of a census report. The person who died but had no one to perform the kispu wanders in a liminal state. They eat scraps, they drink ditch water, they have no rest. The text does not describe this as punishment for sin, it describes it as the mechanical consequence of incomplete procedure. No ritual means no passage. The Giddim remain stuck. This was not metaphor to the Sumerians. This was cause and effect. Once the kispu was performed and the Giddim was released, the journey began, and the texts describe exactly where the dead must travel. The Sumerian word for the netherworld is Kur. It also means mountain or foreign land. Thorkild Jacobson argued in 1976 that the Sumerians located the entrance to the underworld in the direction of the Zagros mountain range, visible from the Mesopotamian plain to the east. The netherworld was beneath the earth, but its entrance was at the edge of the known world, where the flat river valley met the mountains. The death of Ur-Nammu describes the king's journey after death as a physical passage through desolate terrain. The steppe, which the Sumerians called Idin, stretched before the dead like a wasteland. Beyond it lay a river. The texts call it the Hubur. It was a boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Some textual variants describe a ferryman who carries the dead across. This figure appears in Sumerian literature more than 1,000 years before the Greek Charon appears in any surviving text. Katz identifies the Hubur in multiple independent compositions. It is not a metaphor for dying. It is a geographical feature of the afterlife described with the same factual tone that Sumerian scribes used to describe the Euphrates or the Tigris in administrative records. The dead had to cross it. The crossing was a boundary event, and once the Giddim reached the far bank, it arrived at the outer wall of the netherworld. What the text describes next is almost unbearably specific. The descent of Inanna contains the most complete account of the third stage. When Inanna reaches the first gate of the netherworld, she is met by the chief gatekeeper. His name is Neti. He serves Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead. Neti asks Inanna to identify herself. She does. He goes to Ereshkigal and reports who has arrived. Ereshkigal issues instructions. Open the 7 gates. But at each gate remove one item. At the first gate, the Shuyura, the great crown, is removed from her head. At the second gate, the measuring rod and line of lapis lazuli are taken from her hands. At the third gate, the small lapis lazuli stones are removed from her neck. At the fourth gate, the twin oval stones are removed from her breast. At the fifth gate, the golden ring is removed from her hand. At the sixth gate, the breastplate is removed from her chest. At the seventh gate, the royal garment of her body is removed. She passes through the final gate naked, stripped of rank, stripped of power, stripped of every marker of identity she carried in the world above. The text presents this stripping with the cadence of a customs protocol. Each gate follows the same formula. Inanna asks why. The gatekeeper responds with the same phrase each time. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned. Scholars have debated for decades what this sequence means. Katz argues it represents a systematic dismantling of identity, status, and divine power. Jean Bottero of the Sorbonne wrote that this reflects a core Sumerian theological conviction. Death is the great equalizer. The netherworld enforces equality through architecture. Whether god or mortal, everyone arrives at the throne room with nothing. The number 7 was not one poet's invention. The 7 gates appear in the Descent of Ishtar, the Akkadian adaptation of the same story preserved on 7 tablets. They appear in incantation texts spanning centuries. They appear in ritual instructions found at multiple sites. This was canonical Sumerian cosmology. It was taught, recited, and preserved with the same consistency that a legal code would receive. If the Sumerians believed even their gods could be reduced to nothing at these gates, the question the text forces you to ask is what they believed happened to ordinary human souls passing through the same doors. Naked and powerless, stripped of every trace of former life, the Giddim enters the throne room of Ereshkigal, and there it faces a tribunal. Lines 164 through 172 of the Descent of Inanna describe what happens in that chamber. Seated before the arriving dead are the 7 judges of the underworld. The text identifies them with a specific title. The Anunnaki, judges of the netherworld. They fix their eyes upon the one who enters. The text uses a phrase that Kramer translated as the eyes of death. They speak against her. They render their verdict. In the case of Inanna, the goddess herself is struck dead and her corpse is hung on a hook on the wall. These Anunnaki are not the same figures that appear in the Enuma Elish or the creation narratives. Jacobson and Katz both distinguish between the Anunnaki of heaven and the Anunnaki of the underworld. The underworld Anunnaki serve a specific judicial function. They administer the realm of the dead. They assess the arriving souls. They render verdicts. The death of Gilgamesh reveals that even the greatest heroes of Sumerian legend were not exempt from this system. After Gilgamesh dies, he is assigned a permanent role among these judges. He receives authority over the shades of the dead. This is not punishment. It is bureaucratic appointment. The netherworld has an administrative hierarchy. The dead can be assigned positions within it. But what makes this tribunal most disturbing is what it judges. Botero emphasized in his 2001 work Religion in Ancient Mesopotamia that Sumerian afterlife judgment was not about sin and virtue. The Anunnaki judges did not weigh moral behavior. They assessed the manner of death. They assessed whether burial rites were completed. They assessed social standing and the number of sons left behind to perform the kispu. The judgment was structural, not moral. It was paperwork, not piety. The verdict has been rendered. The Giddim now enters its permanent state, and the text describe that state with a level of detail that has unsettled scholars for more than a century. The general description of the cure from the Descent of Inanna and related texts paints a grim, universal picture. A place of dust, a place of darkness, a place of silence. The dead eat clay, they drink dirty water, they are clothed in feathers like birds. The text uses the phrase "the house where those who enter do not come out," the road where those who travel do not return. This is not a place of punishment for the wicked, this is the universal destination. The Sumerians had no paradise for the righteous dead. Everyone arrives at the same dark house. But within that darkness, the texts reveal a hierarchy of conditions, and this is where the literature becomes extraordinary. Gilgamesh, Enkidu Fatin, Idu, Anhu, and the Netherworld contains what may be the oldest afterlife census ever written. Enkidu describes the conditions of the dead to Gilgamesh one category at a time. The man who had 1 son weeps beside his wall. The man who had 2 sons sits on bricks and eats bread. The man who had 3 sons drinks water from a water skin. The man who had 5 sons enters the palace freely. The man who had 7 sons sits among the lesser gods as a companion and listens to music. The man who fell in battle is tended by his father and mother. The man whose body was left in the field finds no rest. His Giddim wanders the earth. The text continues for dozens of lines. Each category is defined by specific conditions: manner of death, number of surviving children, quality of burial. The outcomes are stated with the flat precision of a legal table. There is no moralizing. There is no theology of reward and punishment. There is only procedure. W.G. Lambert observed in his 1980 essay, The Theology of Death, that these netherworld texts share structural features with Sumerian administrative documents. Lists, categories, conditional outcomes. If this, then that. This raises a question that mainstream scholarship has acknowledged, but never fully answered. Why would a Bronze Age civilization construct an afterlife mythology that reads like a bureaucratic manual? And then there is the detail about the stillborn child. Among all the grim fates Enkidu describes, among the dust eaters and the wandering dead and the shade who weeps alone at the base of a wall, the stillborn child is given something no one else receives. The text states that the stillborn child plays at a table of gold and silver with honey and ghee. Botero noted this anomaly. Katz discussed it. No scholar has explained it. The text offers no justification. It simply states that the one who never lived is the one who receives the most comfort in death. The Sumerians recorded this detail and moved on, as if it were obvious. It is not obvious. It is one of the most quietly devastating lines in all of ancient literature. These 5 stages do not exist in isolation. When scholars look beyond Mesopotamia, the same architecture appears in younger traditions across the ancient world. The Egyptian Book of the Dead describes a sequential afterlife journey, separation of the bar from the body, a passage through a dangerous landscape, gates with guardians who must be answered correctly, a judgment tribunal presided over by Osiris and 42 divine assessors, a final state determined by the outcome. The structural parallel to the Sumerian sequence is not subtle. The Egyptian texts are younger. Some date to the Middle Kingdom around 1900 BCE. The Sumerian compositions predate them by centuries. The Greek catabasis tradition carries the same bones: the river crossing, Charon the ferryman, Cerberus at the gate, the judgment of Minos and Rhadamanthus, the differentiated fates of Elysium and Tartarus. Classical scholars, including Walter Burkert and M.L. West, have argued in published academic works for direct or indirect transmission of Near Eastern afterlife motifs into Greek mythology. This is not speculation. This is mainstream comparative scholarship with decades of supporting evidence. Multiple civilizations separated by centuries and thousands of miles recorded afterlife systems built on the same 5-stage sequence. Perhaps they all independently invented the same structure. Perhaps the human brain simply defaults to this architecture when imagining death. Neither explanation accounts for the procedural specificity. The 7 gates, the stripping, the tribunal, the census of the dead organized by conditional categories. These are not universal archetypes. These are structural details. And the oldest surviving versions come from the clay tablets of ancient Sumer. 4,000 years ago in southern Iraq, a scribe pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and recorded what happens after a person dies. 5 stages, in exact order. Those tablets survived the fall of Ur, the conquest of Babylon, and 3,000 years of silence beneath the desert. They even recorded that a stillborn child who never breathed a single breath plays forever at a table set with gold. No scholar has explained why that child alone was given mercy. The tablets did not say.